Good evening and welcome to the 321st meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series on comics, illustration, animation, and the history of text image work. The series is sponsored in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. And our guest tonight is Douglas Fordham. Douglas is a professor and department chair of the art department at the University of Virginia. He is co-editor of Art and the British Empire from 2007 and the author of British Art and the 7 Years' War, Allegiance and Autonomy from 2010. His most recent book, Aquatint Worlds, Travel, Print, and Empire, examines the emergence of the Aquatint travel book in Britain and the significant role that the format played in shaping British conceptions of India, Africa, and China. And his talk tonight is entitled Between Caricature and Ethnography, the illustrated travel book circa 1800. So welcome, Douglas Fordham.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I'm recognizing this is a nice, small, intimate group of many friends here, which I appreciate. And what I want to do, I think, is, well, I'm a little bit of an outlier for this group, as Ben describes it. I'm on the early side, for one. But I think the emergence of caricature in England is certainly something that, much of cartooning and picture storytelling goes back to in one way or another. And I want to shed light on a specific kind of episode within this, which is kind of at the high watermark of caricature in Britain, was also this moment of an explosion of ethnographic illustration. And so what I want to start with, what my plan for tonight is to have, I've got about a 20-minute presentation with some great slides. I hope it kind of lays out the questions I'm interested in and some of the problems I think are really interesting from this moment. And then we'll have plenty of time if there are any questions afterwards that I'm happy to address absolutely anything in this from this moment. Let me click on this. I want to start with what was basically a kind of conundrum. I first came across this book. It's a book that's fairly well known in the history of caricature, and historical sketch on the art of caricaturing with graphic illustrations by a relatively unknown author, antiquarian based in London named J.P. Malcolm. He's actually from Philadelphia, immigrates to London, becomes an antiquarian, a kind of struggling, starving, instead of a starving artist, he's a starving antiquarian. And he's famous for, well, he's not famous for anything really. He's known in caricaturing circles for having written what's now known as the first history of caricature. This was published in London in 1813. And when I called this up at the Lewis Walpole Library, I was just kind of baffled by what I saw, which is exactly what you see. I just took a photo of it with my phone, which is, we've got the title page. And what I took to be the frontispiece here are objects that are clearly, what we might call ethnographic objects or ritual objects from around the world. We might recognize them. Can you see my cursor, Ben, when I do this, when I point? I'm not sure, but there's two feathered heads from.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, so
Very small.
These two feathered heads are clearly from Hawaii, and so I was just kind of like, what is going on? How on earth does this plate kind of match up with the history of caricaturing as he wants to tell it? And basically, it's taken me a while to kind of come up with an answer, and I'm going to kind of venture an answer tonight. And my answer basically is that Malcolm's text it's not a super important text other than being the first history of caricature. It wasn't terribly widely read. It wasn't terribly influential, but it captures what were basically two major trends in Georgian culture, which is to say, or we might call it Romantic era culture, late 18th, early 19th century Britain at that moment. One is really the beginning of ethnography. It's kind of a moment when ethnographic inquiry was still in its infancy. The term hadn't even been coined yet. They were trying out new methods. They were playing with new forms of evidence. And you have to keep in mind that this was a moment that new kind of information, objects, illustrations were coming back from all over the world to London. And this was generating all kinds of new questions and all kinds of new visual problems. And so what we see here is, in fact, you'll recognize this wooden figure is this figure here on the left-hand page. Malcolm went to the British Museum and started drawing sketches of objects that he was really struck by, most of which had very severe kind of facial expressions or deformations. This is a carved wooden figure from Hawaii. And this is a mask from what was then called Nootka Sound. It was made by the Nucha-Nult peoples of the Northwest Coast. And you can see it's being represented down here on the bottom left of the plate. So what ends up, in fact, this is what we're looking at here is plate 1 from Malcolm's book. Malcolm was also an engraver and an illustrator. And so he did all of his own illustrations. He etched all of his own plates for this history of caricature. And what he writes about is and each plate basically corresponds to a different section in the text. And on page 8, which is what this was meant to correspond to, we have him writing, Malcolm writes, quote, "The British Museum contains ample illustrations of the total departure of savage sculptors or carvers from the outlines of man and beast when attempting to represent bipeds and quadrupeds," end quote. Nonetheless, the care with which Malcolm represented these and presumably sketched them and then turned them into a plate like we see here on the left makes it very easy to go back into the British Museum, as I've done, and identify the exact object that he was looking at and representing. This mask from Nootka Sound is one that is generally well described. He flattens it a little bit. He makes the hair a little bit shorter and a little bit more fulsome, but we can immediately make out that this is the object that he's talking about, that he's representing. Of this object, he writes, quote, "Several heads and figures procured on the western coast of America, north of California, are indeed complete caricatures of man. The heads particularly have features monstrous in the extreme, and that they might not be deficient in effect, tufts of coarse hair are fastened onto them, and the teeth of animals appear through the lips," end quote. Now, for Malcolm's readers, the term monstrous was a very familiar term in the 18th century. As a number of scholars like Andrew Curran and Patrick Grail have written, the monstrous in the 18th century occupied an ambiguous position between somewhere between empirical knowledge and the territory of fantasy. And so this is something, but it was often, the monstrous was often referring to something that was very familiar within kind of fairy tales and things quite often quite close to home. Now, both of the objects that I just showed to you from the British Museum came to London from the Captain Cook expeditions, the third and final one of which concluded in 1780, which is why you saw those dates there. These objects date from sometime before 1780, although we can't be sure when. And I think Malcolm was probably inspired by illustrated books about the Cook expedition when he set about illustrating these objects on the page. This is a page from the 1785 publication of Captain Cook's travels, and it's an etching after drawings by John Webber, who is one of the official artists on the expedition. About prints like this, Nicholas Thomas, the anthropologist, writes, quote, "The absence of shadow, the de-emphasis of tone associated with any particular light source, the frequent lack of any framing or border on the page, and the inclusion of a variety of implements of quite distinct sizes presupposes an abstract non-spatial field in which weightless things might equally be standing vertically or laid out on a surface, end quote. That observation really holds for both of these prints, as well as their extreme decontextualization. We have really no idea, there's no sense given of what their relative scale is or what they might have been used for. In fact, the mask that we looked at, there's really even no indication that it's a mask. You'd have to turn it over to kind of recognize that's how it had been designed. In fact, Malcolm's print might even be considered more abstract than the one down here from the Sandwich Islands, which is of course is Hawaii, in that it includes objects from all over the world, both the northwest coast of America as well as the South Pacific, implying perhaps a kind of global primitivism. That's something we would of course associate with the early 20th century, and Malcolm may have been kind of anticipating that in some ways. Now, with a panoply of Eurocentric and racially charged arguments, Malcolm described how and why he thought these caricatures of man were produced. Indigenes can have, quote, proportions that might be mistaken for Europeans, Malcolm suggested, but they are, quote, generally caricatures of human nature, end quote. And even if a beautiful model could be found, quote, a savage cannot transfer just conceptions to wood or stone, end quote. And here we arrive at another charged term. For while monstrosity could be found close to home, a savage evoked a human being fully displaced in either time or space. So in other words, you know, the ancient Picts in England were savages because they were displaced in time, but so of course were some of the people being encountered in the South Pacific, according to folks like Malcolm. Malcolm then arrives at a conclusion, albeit one in which European art is the culmination of a large process of development. Quote, the first native conceptions of genius at all times and in all places are a confused chaos, which may be compared to the frightful dreams that sometimes torture our minds when the body is at rest. But the unfortunate savage or half-civilized sculptor or carver appears to act under some powerful impulse and perpetuates his waking dreams, end quote. These quotes, again, are all from 1813, right? This is pre-ethnographic. This is kind of trying to find one's way through how to interpret these objects in the British Museum. Malcolm assumed, of course, that the aim of art was mimetic realism. What kind of turns out in this book is that caricature is really used as a catch-all term to describe any art from any time or place that pulls in a different direction, right? That's not really aiming for mimetic realism necessarily. Now, in the decades around 1800, which is the period we're looking at, printed images of cultural difference grew exponentially at precisely the same moment that London entered the golden age of English caricature. And of course, no one's associated with this moment more than James Gillray, one of England's greatest caricaturists. And here he's deploying the presentation of the Mahometan credentials. You'll see this treaty that he holds out has a particularly kind of phallic charge, which is scandalizing the queen, who is kind of can't stand not to look through her fan. Many of Gillray's prints, this is one of not hundreds, but one of a great many that we could choose, are drawing on both written and visual accounts of the world beyond, not just England or just beyond Europe, but well beyond that, to Asia, Africa, the New World. Now, most of Gillray's targets in these, of course, were British politicians, right? These are largely political commentary about domestic politics, so that you can see Charles James Fox down here on the right grasping the Mahometan ambassadors, the Turkish ambassador's cloak. This is William Pitt, who's kind of half man, half monkey here at the king's knee. But many of his jokes, of course, because he's referring to these tropes of difference, are also coming at the expense of the subaltern peoples that Britain has been colonizing. In Britain, popular conceptions of race and difference were forged in this crucible of print. And this makes the slipperiness between ethnography on the one hand and caricature on the other, I think, very significant and troubling. And it's been something that's really not been touched on. I think it's an awkward topic, and one that, you know, that an ethnographic print might be read as caricature or vice versa, raises all kinds of interesting and difficult questions for interpretation. Now, I want to take a case study here, in effect, of James Gilray and his representation of peoples from the Middle East. Now, Gilray's representation, in 1794, Hannah Humphrey, who was his landlord, because he lived upstairs, and his print seller, and perhaps his lover at certain points, published 13 prints that represented Turkish, Armenian, and Greek men and women as a series. In one of these prints that we're looking at here, we have a colonel of the Janissaries, which is to say a military leader in the Ottoman Empire's personal security force. The print claims to be drawn by Beerworth, delineate down here, right? No artist such as this has been found. We can tell from the drawing style, the high quality of the print, that this is clearly the work of James Gilray. So he's kind of taking a nom de plume here. And what my best guess for kind of what the motivation was for this series of 13 prints of Turkish and Greek figures is that it's trying, I think that Humphrey and Gilray are looking for a lucrative new market. This is a moment when costume studies of different parts of the world were becoming quite popular in print. And I think they were throwing their hat into the ring. And I think what reinforces that, you know, the attempt to be taken seriously in this genre is the use of aquatint, which was a very new representative, a new tonal medium. It's an etching process. Won't go into that unless we want to talk about it later. But it was most of the really high-end travel books like Thomas and William Daniels' Oriental Scenery or The Costume of China by William Alexander were done in aquatint. And so we see in the use of medium a kind of attempt to be taken seriously among these new costume studies of the time. Now, it turns out that this seems to have been a failed project. We know that Gilray had a great many and Humphrey had a great many of these copies that were left unsold, and they didn't really try it again. It was an attempt, and a kind of a failed attempt. And now the copies are quite difficult to come by. It doesn't seem that there was any text to accompany these. Now, let's say William Alexander's Costume of China, you would have a descriptive page of text opposite the aquatint plate that would explain what you were looking at, which was seen to be really important. Or it might illustrate, let's say, a travelogue by someone. We don't know what the text with these would have been or if there was any at all. 4 years later, Hannah Humphrey published another print with a questionable attribution. Now, according to the etched label down at the bottom, this was, quote, supposed to be a correct representation of a Mameluke chief from a sketch by a French officer by whom he was taken prisoner, end quote. Now, Mamelukes were skilled cavalrymen in North Africa who provided staunch resistance against the French invasion of Egypt in 1798. This print is in the British Museum, and it was previously attributed to James Gilray. But now the description simply says previously attributed to. They seem to have doubted, and they describe, for example, the ill-drawn galloping horse online. And they note that quote, the horse is curiously flecked in a manner which resembles a leopard skin under the saddle, which is to say you get kind of the same kind of flecking on the leopard skin that you do on the horse's flank. Basically, the British Museum is saying this is too ugly and too clumsy to be by Gilray. But it's published by Hannah Humphrey. Of that we're certain. You look at this handwriting, and the handwriting certainly could be by Gilray's. And my sense is that this is a print of, this is Gilray again, kind of like he did with Beerworth before, impersonating a bad French artist. You know, in a sense, the profile of the horse and Mamluk rider, quite confident, quite good. But then you start looking at individual spots, like let's say the way in which it's shaded, let's say on the rider's arm or on the blade of the sword, and it's just absolute straight lines. It's very clumsy, and there's a kind of mismatch between the confidence of the drawing of the outline and the clumsiness of the shading that just suggests to me, along with the handwriting, that this is probably by Gilray. And I think, you know, that Gilray was, I suspect, disguising his authorship here, validating the eyewitness sketch on which it was ostensibly based, and ridiculing French drawing kind of all in one blow. If I'm right about that, and I'm inclined then to view the Colonel of the Janissaries and the Mameluke chief as basically test runs for what would become Gilray's masterpiece of counterfeit ethnography, the Egyptian Sketches. This was a 6-print series published in 1799, making fun of the French invasion of Egypt. The title page is what we're looking at here. And you can see it says on here, extracted from the portfolio of an ingenious young artist attached to the Institut National at Cairo, which was found on board a tartan intercepted on its voyage to Marseille. Now, the British government had, in fact, intercepted genuine letters by very unhappy French soldiers back to their families in France. They intercepted them by sea. And the British government and the Prime Minister had very cleverly decided to translate and publish those in London to kind of humiliate the French forces and to show what a disaster this military escapade was. Now, there were no sketches intercepted that would look anything like this, which is what Gilray publishes, presumably as a series of intercepted sketches. This is an entire fiction by Gilray. And what I love about it is that this time around, Gilray admits that he has a hand in it. It's etched by James Gilray from the original intercepted drawing, which is a fiction, right? So in other words, he lets his full skill as a satirist and as a printmaker show here. Here you have the clinched, you have the Mameluke holding the reins between his teeth, and you have some wonderful kind of ethnographic details, such as, again, we have the leopard skin under the saddle, etc. But all of these kind of ethnographic touches are brought to bear on the humiliation of French forces who are fleeing here from the attack. Now, so just a note here about caricature at this moment, because just like ethnography wasn't really a standard term yet, there was no real sense of a field, although some of the questions that would become anthropology or ethnography were already taking shape. The same is true with caricature. Caricature is traditionally defined as a portrait which shows the features of a subject in comic distortion without losing its resemblance. I took that from E.H. Gombrich. Now, this definition applies very well to Gilray's caricatures of King George III or William Pitt or Napoleon. But what did one call the caricature of a group of people that was marked by class, profession, or ethnicity? Now, William Hogarth, back in the 1740s and 50s, had proffered character as the term that would describe fictionalized individuals drawn from a close observation of life, which would be distinct from caricaturas, which would be of recognizable individuals. Characters, Hogarth, like his friend Henry Fielding, characters were considered the visual equivalent of a novelist character, a character in a novel, which was also a brand new form, literary form at this moment. By the late Georgian period, let's say by around 1800, the single sheet satires of Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, and others were generally referred to as caricatures, whether they illustrated recognizable individuals or representatives of a group, like Gilray's Mamluk. So this would have been kind of called a caricature, although there's neither of these are individuals who might be recognizable. Yet to emerge was the term stereotype, which is still used today to attribute the attributes of an individual to a group. And that term, interestingly enough, is borrowed, of course, directly from printmaking. A stereotype was a new process begun in 1800, but not really made commercially viable until the 1830s or 1840s, where you would take either an engraving or a woodcut and you would make a copy that you could then replicate numerous times. So in other words, the wear and tear that printmaking takes on the matrix, on the plate, could be obviated by making a copy of the matrix itself. That's what a stereotype was. And the term stereotype emerges, according to the OED, as early as the 1850s, but it just means an accurate copy. You've stereotyped that. You've stereotyped my music or my text by copying it perfectly. It wasn't until the 1920s, as far as I can tell, that the term picked up its negative connotations, which it now has, in which a stereotype would refer to a preconceived or oversimplified idea. All of this is just to say that neither ethnography nor caricature are entirely stable terms. And indeed, caricature is asked to carry an awful lot of water around 1800 to refer both to what we might think of as Gilray's classic caricatures of the king, but also to images like this, which are really basically what we would call stereotypes, or stereotypes would probably be pretty close, or racial or racist satire as well. Now, a recognition that Britons might read ethnography farcically, or they might read visual satire ethnographically, I think opens up all kinds of interesting new questions for the art historian, for like how were these prints that we've many of which of the world, the greater world, and how were they interpreted? How were they viewed by consumers who first purchased them? This is a title page and a single plate from a book that Samuel Daniel made in the early 19th century called African Scenery and Animals. This is an entirely serious publication in that he went to Cape Town. He traveled very, very widely at the time around South Africa, made a great many sketches, and then turned them into a very high-end Aquatint publication that was hand-colored. Now, and one of the aims of this publication was to illustrate the San people of the desert, the Ngasa people of the Eastern Cape, the Tswana of what was in the northern regions of South Africa, and the Khoikhoi peoples, whom were referred to then as the Hottentot peoples, in a derogatory Dutch term that mocked the way that they spoke. But what Daniel does is he tries, and what we see here on this print at the bottom right is it's called a Kora Hottentot village, I have to read it carefully, on the left bank of the Orange River. Which was, so these are people that would have been originally from the Western Cape, from the Cape Town region. They'd been displaced up to the Orange River, and they are ferrying some sheep across the Orange River here. And what Daniel gives us is a kind of, again, a proto-ethnographic view of each of these different language groups, African indigenous language groups, as if they're completely untouched by colonialism, which was, of course, a fiction by 1800, but it was one that Daniel kind of creates with his publication. But how were Londoners supposed to read a publication like Daniel's African Scenery and Animals when it's absolutely contemporary with the exploitation and display of Sarah Bartman, who was an extremely well-known figure in London, who was exhibited before a paying public as the Hottentot Venus. And these are two aquatints. Again, these are prints that are kind of ostensibly ethnographic, but they are in fact also, also attempts to promote the paid exhibition of Sarah Bartman in London. She was forcibly, Sarah grew up as a Ganakwa woman, and she was forcibly displaced from her homeland by Afrikaner farmers, who then gave her the name Bartman, which means bearded man or wild man, to kind of indicate her savage status. She was forced into servitude. Then she was taken down to Cape Town, where she was begun to be displayed to troops in what was then the brothel, the main brothel of Cape Town. And then a Scottish surgeon decided that he could make a fortune off displaying her to a paying London crowd. And he displaced her to London, where he then displayed her and then took her on a tour around England. And so these prints are, in a sense, a kind of, they're just a kind of ephemera of what was this paid exhibition. But here again, I mean, the way in which one reads these very disturbing, very exploitative images of Sarah Bartman, where she's being, and also I had to mention that, the notion of the Hottentot Venus was, I think, initially probably penned as a kind of satirical term for her exhibition, but it came to be kind of viewed quasi-seriously as a notion that the beauty of African women, or particularly Southern African women, was simply incompatible or completely dissonant from that of European tastes in women. So again, a kind of, there's an aesthetic component to these, to the language as well as the printmaking here that plays out through Sarah Bartman's exploitation. I think that in many ways, the exhibition of Bartman undercut all the subtleties, the ethnographic subtleties that Samuel Daniel was trying to make with African Scenery and Animals, I think were largely lost on the London public. And I think that, there was a tendency to simply collapse all representations of African women into the Hottentot Venus, or a kind of radical otherness that would make kind of subtle distinctions of language, culture, material culture irrelevant. Or let's take a slightly more subtle example. Then I'm always very hesitant to show the Sarah Bartman images, because they're so the story is so disturbing and the images are so exploitative that I don't like to do it casually, and I don't want to. And there's a great many of those images that could be shown. But I also want to kind of make the point that this was something, the confusion of ethnography and satire, visual satire, could play out on a much more subtle register as well. If we look at something like this print, which was also after a Samuel Daniel drawing, and it's titled "A Boer's Wife Taking Her Coffee." And this appeared in a travel book by John Barrow, who was one of Samuel Daniel's patrons, called Travels into the Interior of Southern Africa. Now, the text in Barrow, that in the book that this plate it refers to, I'm just going to read a passage from, quote, "The women of the African peasantry lead a life of the most listless inactivity. The mistress of the family, with her coffee pot constantly boiling before her on a small table, seems fixed to her chair like a piece of furniture. And it is the business of a little black boy or a Hottentot, wholly naked, to attend her with a small branch of a tree or a fan made of ostrich feathers to flap away the flies. The annexed sketch drawn from nature by Mr. Daniel is so true a picture of a Boer's apartment that any further description would be superfluous," end quote. Now, this is, of course, the British were supplanting the Boers, or they were supplanting the Dutch in Southern Africa when they took control of the Western Cape. And they had all kinds of incentives to kind of denigrate the Afrikaner Boer, which is to say Dutch colonial farmers that we see here. And yet this is something that we might call this an anti-conversation piece, right? Because they're not communicating at all. But this is also like, as Horace Walpole said of William Hogarth, this is a picture, this is written as a scene of furniture, right? This is an entire story basically written from the details of material culture, from the coffee pot to the feathers, which were used in high-end women's headdresses just a few decades earlier, to the cat arching its back and rubbing itself. And I think even the use of aquatint here is very interestingly deployed in that the Afrikaner woman, of course, who is ostensibly white, she's a European settler, is in the shadow and both her feet and her face, and she has exactly the same skin tonality as the Khoi boy who is naked and fanning her. And so I think there's a real kind of British imperial bias here in this picture, suggesting though also that the Boer the Afrikaner exploitation of the Khoi was ruining both of them, right? It was mutually debasing both cultures. And the British kind of held themselves up as defenders of the Khoi, although as we've seen with the display of Sarah Bartman, that's a very questionable kind of claim. Okay, I just want to conclude with one more print. This is a well-known print by George Cruikshank of the court at Brighton, a la Chinese, from 1816. Of course, he is ridiculing the Prince of Wales's Brighton Pavilion, which is a melange of different styles and from Chinese, Indian, architectural, and interior decorating styles. But I think the logic of this print might now be a little bit more apparent. Again, going back to J.P. Malcolm's history, with which I began this talk, he believed that caricature could be found at kind of both ends of the civilizational spectrum. First, as an index of primitivism, like those objects from the South Pacific, and then ultimately as an index of English political liberty. Quote, "The history of caricaturing, although intended to be general, would naturally narrow into that of English caricatures, for the obvious reason that in no other country has the art met with equal encouragement, because no other portion of the globe enjoys equal freedom," end quote. So while Sarah Bartman stands on a pedestal behind the prints, alluding to caricature's primitive origins, the Chinese accoutrements surrounding the prints undercut the progressive political freedoms of the Englishman. So part of the political critique that Cruikshank is making here is that the future King George IV, the Prince of Wales, is kind of slighted English traditions of liberty by making himself a kind of quasi-Eastern despot. And this bottom detail here, I think, is really remarkable. Anticipating the gifts that Lord Amherst would take with him on the next embassy to China, Cruikshank has piled curious prints alongside John Cleland's pornographic novel, Fanny Hill. But strangest of all are the two prints labeled front and back view of myself, right here, in which the Prince of Wales is represented in the round, like some English Hottentot Adonis. Whether this is caricature or ethnography, I'll leave entirely to your own imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. If you have any questions or comments, you can drop your name in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask those questions.
Do you want me to close the slides? Or we'll just leave
sure. It's up to you. I mean, it's nice to look at these images.
Yeah, sure. I'll get back to the full image too. Okay. A lot going on in this print. This would have been this is the kind of caricature of Lord Amherst, who was about to make the second kind of major embassy to China. following up on Lord McCartney's in the 1790s.
So have you found the models that Cruikshank would have been constructing all those little ethnographic details from? Are those from existing prints or from actual artifacts that he saw?
It's a good question. I've not tried to track down specific motifs with this one. There's a very famous Gilray print about Lord McCartney embassy to China, where I have kind of tracked down individual references, and a lot of them are costume books. Those costume books I was telling you about a costume of China, a costume of India, were a very, very rich resource for the cartoonist.
Right. So, yeah. So that book, that first book about caricature, does he at all go into the causes of, European naturalism, lens-based images, that whole history? Or does he
I'm
just
sorry, Ben,
assume?
you cut out.
Oh,
Your
sorry,
question cut out just a little bit at the beginning.
sorry. Does that
Can you just say that ask that one more time?
Does that Malcolm book go into the reasons behind European naturalism, as opposed to more like conceptual image making?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
the
that's a good
whole
question.
lens-based history, people looking at
Right.
all kinds of lens-based images in Europe or wherever they had it.
Right. No, yeah, I mean, he takes pictorial naturalism, since it had been developed, in the ways that it had been developed since the Renaissance, as as a given, in terms of as the ultimate inevitable aim of all pictorial art, and also as a kind, we have to keep in mind that that was also seen as a kind of index of Western cultural superiority at this moment of empire. That even when you get into 1850s with the Crystal Palace in London and things like that, that Europeans were very willing to grant Persians and Indians and Chinese the merits as decorative artists, but they viewed kind of all other kind of pictorial arts as a failure, relatively speaking, and they took very little interest in them until, as the story would go, until Picasso comes around. That's not exact. That's a shortcut, but.
Yeah, there's a question here. Somebody has their hand up. Go ahead, sorry, go ahead.
That's me. Hi, everybody, this is Christina. Thank you for a very intriguing and provocative question, Doc. It's really interesting for me as I delve with the question of English liberty. And that's where I'm trying to think about, do you think that this is very much tied to the openness and then the medium of satire in English works, or is it really also, could this be extrapolated to French satire, for example? Have you come across the specificity? I really like how you kind of describe this sense of the index of primitivism as well as an index of England's political liberty, but I'm wondering if that is the essence, and if this is something that could distinguish what you're trying to do versus other types of like satire, let's say Australia or like France. Does that make sense?
I think. Hi, Christina. Thanks for coming tonight. It's a good question. I mean, I do think that at this moment, at this historical moment, certainly English caricaturists have a great deal more liberty and freedom to publish satires of the king and queen, of the royal family, etc., than any other place in Europe really at the time, and certainly a great deal more so than France. Now, France was it's hard to talk to. France is changing year by year over this period as well, but their resistance to caricature is, the regime's resistance to caricature is fairly consistent with a few exceptional years. So I think that is one of the things that I think that's one of the things that Malcolm is drawing our attention to, and claiming this is such a distinctively English phenomenon. I'm fascinated by how weird his project is, because what he's suggesting is that caricature is a universal human impulse, but that the story culminates in our English present right now, because it's the perfection of political freedom, and it's a very kind of odd shift from general humanism to very specific political argumentation. So I guess I'm saying I'm still kind of wrestling a little bit with how this picture goes together, and how seriously to take it as well. I mean, there's something. Everything he does is a little bit half baked, and so I don't want to spend too long thinking about something that I think was kind of a work of convenience that he hoped would sell. But it is a good question.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like, even if you extrapolate to the 20th century with Braque and Picasso, right? What are these representations of primitive bodies and women, right? That it throws us back into this context, which I think there is an important correlation in when you're studying, like, Picasso's very much prior to Cubism, this very big woman that it's almost like a déjà vu, So they are reappropriated in the sense of, like, it took all this time. It took until Picasso, to maybe just being discussed in a French context, or like in a different context than the English, is what I'm trying to say, perhaps. I don't know.
Right.
Please for thought, but thank you so much. It's really provoking a lot of questions, and we can continue.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I mean, one quick thing I'll say, just it only after I got into this project that I realized that the person who really wrestled with this in the 20th century as a historian was E.H. Gombrich, and he and Chris started that whole history of caricature before the Second World War, before they both had to flee Nazi Austria, and they were heavily, Chris in particular was a Freudian analyst, and so it had a very strong kind of notions. And their initial theory was that was a kind of progressive one, in which they believed that caricature could only happen in the West once the West had given up its magical belief in the power of individual representation. And then Gombrich later said, he basically disavowed that and said that was way too simple. After the Second World War, he said that was way too simplistic, but he continues to work on primitivism. He continues to work on caricature, and he's the one that's kind of wrestling with some of these questions about the relationship of caricature, primitivism, modernism, expressionism. And so he, and I'm still kind of going through. I had to read Gombrich as a grad student, and I hadn't touched it since. And now I'm back into reading Gombrich again, and really enjoying it, but also kind of marveling at the way in which he tackles these problems.
Right. Anybody else? What are the other plates like in that book? Does he come into primitive European art, like things from?
Yeah, I should have shown more.
Or is it all?
He has one. He has a plate of all Chinese figurines from the British Museum, but then he also does this thing that is really amazing, which he goes in and he represents certain illuminated manuscripts, medieval illuminated manuscripts from the British Museum that have those kind of caricature-y marginalia. He represents those. And then the final few plates are different heads that were compiled from different fairly recent English caricatures from the 1740s, 50s, 60s, that kind of thing. And so, I mean, again, he's very ahead of his time in a way. Like, he's the first person that I know of who makes a reproductive print after what were already very cheap prints, right? And so he's doing as an antiquarian, he's kind of recognizing that this cheap visual culture is of merit. It's of a kind of, it's of its distinctive, has a distinctive cultural thing to say. And I think he was afraid that it was going to be lost. I see Cindy has her hand up.
I do. Hi, Douglas. Nice to see you. Thank you for this. There's so much to think about. But one of the things that I'm really, I guess, maybe even worrying about right at this moment, first, that it's wonderful how this presentation makes caricature or satire even richer in its sort of mediation of all the kinds of things that are going on in the British public in terms of illustration. But I'm wondering how you, in this much more complicated and even maybe pernicious kind of reading of some kinds of satire, how do you deal with this with your students today?
That's a great question. I haven't yet.
And I don't even know if
that's not true.
Really expect you to have an answer, but it just seems like it's even more fraught.
Yeah, that's a great question, Cindy. To be honest, I've only really talked about this kind of material recently. I mean, this thinking of caricature and ethnography kind of conflation and confusion, I've only done with grad students so far. So I haven't really thought about how I'd want to do it, let's say, in a large undergraduate lecture. Carefully is the answer. Yeah. I don't know. Ben and I were talking about this earlier too. That these are, cartooning and caricaturing can be very offensive and very difficult by design, and so one has to think about that. I have in undergraduate seminars, we have shown and talked about some of the Sarah Bartman imagery. And but we do that, or actually more, some students have chosen her as a topic or have brought in images of her for their own presentations. And I think the thing that's helped me there is there's just a couple of South African historians who have done this extraordinary work to uncover who she was before she was abducted to England. And what we've been able to do is whenever those images are shown, I just make very, very sure that we humanize her, that we talk about like what language group she was from, what part of South Africa she was from, what her family did, why she went to Cape Town, and that, of course, that just makes the story more horrific. But it's helpful. But it takes it out of the realm of kind of pure representation into one of colonization. And I think, but again, I only really want to bring those images in when I have the chance to at least provide some of that context, because I think doing it without that is unfair to everyone, really.
Right. It's actually fascinating to think about the moments where people like Gombrich and Chris and Edward Fuchs are thinking about satire at a moment where stereotypes are being used to dehumanize people at the same time. That seems like a really interesting thing to think about.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning Diane Chris, because for those of you who might want to chase this down some more, but she does her work on Jamaica. She has a chapter there on caricatures related to Jamaica and abolition, where I think this one of the smartest takes on the relationship between caricature, race, ethnography from this very same moment. I see we have a question up from Jimga, who is a practicing cartoonist from Nigeria, also in Charlottesville right now. But Jim, I'll go ahead and let me take your question. I'd like to know if some of these ethnographic illustrations were published in newspapers of the period. And that's a great question, but it's also a very easy one to answer, which is no, because newspapers just weren't, it's another couple of decades before we start to get illustrations in newspapers. We do have illustrations in magazines, but they're still overwhelmingly etched plates that are tipped in. And is only with the spread of wood engraving, which is a relief method where you can print it with the letterpress, that you start to get it. So Illustrated London News, for example, is a great thing, and that really gets going, I think, in the 1830s. Thanks. Megan Walsh.
Hey.
Hey.
Sorry, very dark in here. So this is kind of a half-baked question that's kind of piggybacking off of what Jim was asking. I'll turn more towards the light. So I apologize, my internet was going in and out during your talk, so if you've already answered this, I'm sorry. But I'm wondering about how those who are looking at these images are receiving them, particularly in light of this kind of tension that seems to be arising between like what caricature is. Like on one hand, you have these political satires that seem to be, you know, attacking like the royalty and whatnot, paralleling these images of native peoples that the British are coming into contact with that has this kind of scientific tinge. So I'm kind of wondering how audiences are separating out what is like the innate character in a way, like thinking about caricature as a fundamental thing. Like how are they understanding that one is almost like pseudoscientific and the other is meant to be this kind of funny political barb, or are they?
You know, I think there's lots of, it's a great, thanks, Megan. I think there's lots of good visual clues about that the artist and or etcher is giving to the audience. And so one of those would be, you know, this kind of like what we're talking about here, where, you know, this kind of plate, you know, is clearly suggesting, okay, these are artifacts from a different place, right? And so there are conventions like that certainly help. And scientific illustration has a number of conventions that follow that. But I think, you know, but there's a lot of wiggle room. And I think, I guess I have a kind of, I didn't say this in the talk, but I have a kind of general feeling that when you get moments where ethnography starts to look like caricature or vice versa, there's a kind of strategic reason, right? And one of the things about cartooning is you get to say things you can't actually say in real life. And, you know, and in some cases, those can be deeply racist, deeply offensive things. And I think, you know, I think that the ambiguity is played pretty hard on both sides of the ledger, either by kind of pseudoscience looking to create kind of racist ideas, to render racist ideas popular, or by caricaturists looking to make their work funnier by embedding it in the latest kind of scientific insights or the pretensions of science, or right, whatever it might be. But I think that so I guess you know, there's plenty of, if you want to make, if an artist wanted to make a print that would be purely read as science or purely read as caricature, I think they have the means to do that. So I think that when we're seeing this ambiguity, there's a kind of strategy, whether it's conscious or not. I think we may never know in some cases, but I think that there's that. But that also made this print so weird, right? Because in this case, you've got such a scientific presentation of objects next to an art of caricaturing. And I think that was the thing that really threw me, right? If we'd seen these objects, if we'd seen, let's say, one of the Hawaiian feathered heads in a hilarious kind of send up of a kind of, you know, drum circle, which we certainly could see at that moment. And then I wouldn't have been so surprised. It was the juxtaposition that threw me.
Great, thank you so much.
Hello?
Yeah, Jimga.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much, Douglas, for the presentation. I think I'm now able to use my mic finally.
Okay, great.
Yes. I was actually taken from your last statement concerning like trying to touch on the area of sensibilities in terms of cartoonists not actually being able to say certain truths about society. Then that takes me to a particular drawing of someone that you talked about, that though you could actually get to know the person through the person's style, through the artist's style, but the artist did not sign that. So, yeah,
this one, yeah.
Okay, yes, exactly. So I was wondering if that is like a case of maybe masking or censorship, because sometimes if the cartoonist is actually or the cartoonist thinks that what is presenting could be too dangerous for him or her, the cartoonist could actually mask his name under another name entirely. So I was wondering if such happened that time, maybe a deliberate masking, you know, to circumvent censorship and all that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jimga. That's you know, I have a feeling that Cindy or Christina and maybe some others in this room may have better answers to some of that than I would. In terms of specific examples when that happens, I mean, certainly that's always an option. In this specific case, I don't think that's why I don't think Gilroy is doing it because this image in particular would have been problematic to an English audience, would have been problematic to an Ottoman audience, but not a British audience. I think the reason, I don't know exactly why he did it, but I think that, you know, again, Gilroy was so well known for turning out images like this that I think he wanted to put a little bit of distance between himself when he was trying to do a serious costume study. But in practice, it's so easily identifiable as a Gilroy on style that I don't know if it would have fooled many people, which is why I think this one is actually a much more successful masking of his own identity. Which again, I think is just he's trying to play maybe just a slightly different side of the market. He and Hannah Humphrey are trying to kind of diversify their portfolios a little bit away from caricature and some of the other things they were selling. That's my best guess in this case. In terms of artists really trying to kind of going under pseudonyms or you know, masking their identity, certainly there are quite a few anonymous prints. And I think that the higher you went up in the social scale, there were amateurs, aristocratic amateurs who were often parliamentarians or whatever, who would send ideas in to, let's say, to Mary Darley or someone else in London to engrave, and they would keep their identity secret. So there is some of that gamesmanship going on. But for a professional caricaturist like Gilroy, I mean, the amazing thing is they could get away with almost anything without any prosecution at this moment.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Anyone else?
Thanks for the comments and questions, everyone. That was really nice.
So if not, maybe we can thank you for that, all of the questions your talk raised, and thank you for this presentation. It's
great.
See
Thank
you
you,
next.
Ben.